This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Nitsahone and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10. Today we're going to look at Mana Rocks. A Mana Rock is an artifact that can produce mana. They can be quite powerful since they can allow for some serious fast mana, since they let you put something into play that makes mana in addition to your normal land for the turn. For me, this means it does not include cards like Chromatic Star, which sacrifice to add mana. To be a Mana Rock, a card has to be able to produce mana without being sacrificed. An important caveat here is that this video, like most of my MTG Top 10s, does not take into account EDH. Mana Rocks are obviously very important there, but this is really a list of the Mana Rocks that have been the most successful at the highest competitive level in Magic, not necessarily a list of the best Mana Rocks for EDH. As usual, I only look at formats that are or used to be played at premier events. In other words, Vintage, Legacy, Extended, Modern, Standard, Pioneer, and so forth. Also, I excluded the Power 9 Moxen from this list because including them would make it incredibly boring. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how exactly I rank cards in these videos. A Pro Tour or Mythic Championship Top 8, as well as Legacy and Vintage Championship Top 8s are worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix Top 8 is worth 1 point. Now, let's see what we have at number 10. At number 10, it is CULTIVATOR'S CARAVAN, the most recent card to make this list. The CARAVAN is a decent mana rock since it can produce any color of mana, but the fact that it costs 3 to do this makes it seem a bit underpowered compared to a lot of the mana rocks we'll see on this list. However, it is the only mana rock on this list that can also turn into a creature, which the CARAVAN can do thanks to being a vehicle. So it is pretty nice to have a source of fixing and ramping turn into a creature that can smash into your opponent for 5 damage. That's a lot of upside. All of the CARAVAN's points came in Standard, where it was played in Mardu vehicles, a deck with lots of artifact and vehicle upside. It doesn't hurt that it could help fix mana for the 3-color deck either. At number 9, it's Mind Stone. This is another mana rock that in terms of the mana it produces isn't all that exciting. But like the CARAVAN, it provides additional value that most mana rocks can't provide. Once you are in the later part of the game and have no need for Mind Stone, you can cash it in for a card, which is some pretty nice late game value. Especially because in the early game, it puts you ahead of your opponent in mana by a whole turn. Mind Stone has been printed in a standard legal set twice. First, in Weatherlight back in 1997, and the second time in the 10th edition core set. It only managed 2 points the first time it went through Standard, but the second time around it found considerably more success. There were decks in that format based around cards like Makeshift Mannequin and Revelark, and Mind Stone was pretty nice at making those cards come down a lot earlier. Almost all of its points in Standard came in decks featuring one of those 2 cards. More recently, it has also been played in several modern decks, with the most points coming in Eldrazi Tron, and a few coming as well in Urza decks. It was also one of the many artifacts to be featured in Krark Clan Ironworks decks, but that deck got banned out of Modern earlier this year. Still, Mind Stone is a very active card, as Urza decks and Eldrazi Tron aren't going anywhere in Modern right now. It could improve its position on this list going forward. At number 8, it is Mox Diamond. While the Power 9 Moxen were excluded from this list, cards that were printed which were intended to be fixed versions of the Moxen were eligible, and that's what we have with the Diamond. Instead of just being a 0-mana artifact that can tap for mana, Mox Diamond makes the person who is playing it 2-for-1 themselves to get that mana, since it makes you discard a land card when you play it. Still, the cost for the Diamond is definitely worth it, as being able to play 2 mana spells on turn 1 is a huge deal. The one advantage it has over the original Moxen is that it can tap for mana of any color. It didn't see much play in Block or Standard, but in Extended it was used in a variety of combo decks because it let you go off with your combo 1 turn earlier than you normally would. This included decks built around the busted Megrim Jar combo, as well as reanimation decks. Legacy is where Mox Diamond has been the most successful, and this is despite the fact that it was banned in the format between 1999 and 2004. In Legacy, it is also mostly seen play in combo decks, with Dark Depths being its most frequent home. It has found a lot of success just in 2019, putting up 12 points just this year, so it may be poised to move further up the list going forward. At number 7, it's Grim Monolith, a mana rock that can tap for a whopping 3 mana. It does come with the downside. It doesn't untap normally, but the good news is that you can untap it if you're willing to pay 4 mana. Despite that downside, this card gives such a huge mana boost that it has seen a lot of play. In Urza's block constructed alone, the Monolith had 6 Pro Tour top 8s, and they all came at the same event. Artifact-heavy decks in that format ran Voltaic Key, which made it easy to get around the Monolith's downside. This was also used in Standard and Extended Tinker decks. In Standard, it was also played in Wildfire decks, where it could help you accelerate into the eponymous sorcery, while also making it so you have mana left behind because you have a mana rock. In Legacy, it has managed some points in Hivemind decks since it could allow you to quickly accelerate into it. Recently, it has found some success in Vintage Mystic Forge decks, but that card was recently restricted, so it'll be interesting to see if it sees play in Magic's most powerful format going forward. At number 6, it is Mana Vault, which bears some similarities to Grim Monolith, but in most ways it is just more powerful. Because it only costs 1 mana, you get it down much earlier and get that 3 mana boost going very early, potentially allowing you to play something that costs 5 mana on turn 2. Sure, like the Monolith, it remains tapped until you pay for it, and it also has the added downside of damaging you when it is tapped during your draw step, but those downsides are definitely worth it. Despite all that power, it didn't really see much play in Standard, which wasn't even really Standard at the time, it was just Magic. It only had 1 Pro Tour top 8, which seems kind of crazy, until you remember that these decks could run singleton copies of the Power 9, in which case Mana Vault looks a lot less impressive. In Extended, though, where the Power 9 were never legal, it saw a fair bit of play, mostly in combo decks like Tolarian Academy, Megrim Jar, and Necro Donate. As we've seen for other mana rocks, sometimes they are at their best in combo decks because they can really accelerate the timeline for them. It has also been played in Vintage too, originally in decks like Mud and Tezzerator. It has also started seeing a lot of play in paradoxical outcome decks in Vintage, which run a bunch of mana rocks that you can bounce to your hand and then recast. If you do it with something like Mana Vault, you're actually gaining mana since you get to replay it untapped. At number 5, I have Springleaf Drum. I thought for a while about whether I wanted to include the drum because unlike other mana rocks on this list, it does ask you to have something extra in play to make it work, but in the end I decided to include it because what it requires of you isn't anything crazy. I mean, in any creature-based deck, Springleaf Drum definitely is just a straight-up mana rock, and a pretty nice one at that since it only costs a single mana and can immediately tap for mana of any color. Keep in mind too that because of how the drum is worded, you can actually tap down a brand new creature for mana too, since the cost of the spell doesn't involve the tap symbol for the creature. And unless your new creature has haste, a brand new creature is often a pretty untapped resource, but the drum makes sure you can do something with them. Pretty much all of the decks that have run the drum also have some other artifact synergy, and that makes the drum even better. It has 2 standard legal printings, one in Lorwyn and the second one in Born of the Gods. In that standard format, it was played in a blue-red artifact deck. The rest of its points have come in Extended and in Modern, pretty much exclusively in Affinity decks. Those decks tend to run a ton of cheap artifacts and get a bunch of damage on the board as quickly as possible, and the drum can really help with that, while also just happening to be an artifact. Affinity decks continue to be relevant in Modern, and that's good news for Springleaf Drum. At number 4, it is Chrome Mox, which, like Mox Diamond, is another fixed Mox. Chrome Mox makes you imprint a card on it, meaning you are using up 2 cards for the mana boost. That certainly makes for a far more balanced card than the original Moxen, but as you can tell from the Mox being so high up on this list, it's still a really powerful card. Even if you're spending 2 cards, you're still getting a repeatable source of mana for 0 mana, and that's a pretty great payoff. Chrome Mox was enough of a problem, even from the beginning, that it was banned in Legacy and restricted in Vintage right after coming out. It was, however, legal in both Standard and Extended. In the latter, it basically amounted to a staple, at least in decks that were either aggro decks or combo decks, or that cared about artifacts. That was a pretty huge chunk of the metagame. The Mox was such a format-defining card for Extended that when the format was ended in 2011 and replaced by the new Modern format, Chrome Mox was preemptively banned because Wizards was tired of seeing a card that made it way too easy to get way ahead on mana. These days, it is legal in both Legacy and Vintage. In Legacy, it sees a ton of play because that format doesn't have access to the Power 9 Moxen, but it has also managed a bit of success in Vintage too. At number 3, it's Mox OPAL, which is another fixed Mox. This one is just a useless hunk of metal unless you can get Metalcraft going, at which point it's actually better than the original Moxen since it can add mana for any color. Sure, Metalcraft is definitely something that requires some setup, but there have been really effective artifact decks in multiple formats over the years, and in those, you always have Metalcraft going, and if that's the case, this is an incredibly powerful card. especially because it not only is an artifact synergy, it is an artifact itself. In Block and Standard, it was played in Tempered Steel decks. In Modern, it has been a keycard for Affinity decks, which can play it alongside Springleaf Drum, which makes it really easy to get Metalcraft going as early as turn 1. It also has been played in other artifact-heavy decks like Krark Clan Ironworks, Lantern Control, and most recently, Urza. It also has a single point legacy from a Painter deck. It is played in Vintage decks too, primarily in Tezzerator and Paradoxical Storm combo decks. 2019 alone has been a pretty good year for Mox OPAL, which has added 18 points to its score this year, and that score is just going to keep going up. At number 2, we have another 0 mana Mana Rock, Mana Crypt. It gives you a repeatable source of 2 colorless mana every turn for 0 mana. Sure, it will damage you some of the time, but that downside just isn't enough for this card to be anything short of super powerful. This power made it so that Mana Crypt has really only ever been legal in Vintage, where it's restricted. And while it isn't as much of a staple as the Power 9 artifacts, it is played in a ton of Vintage decks, especially artifact-heavy decks like Mud and Ravager Shops. And at number 1, probably not surprising anyone, it is Sol Ring. While not technically part of the Power 9, the ring does have a very high power level, and if there were a Power 10, it would probably be included. It costs 1 mana to tap for 2, giving you a huge advantage over your opponent. In fact, the advantage is so great that Sol Ring is only legal in Vintage, where it is restricted, and it has maintained that status for the entire time Wizards has had a banned and restricted list, which began back in 1994. And it was banned and restricted right alongside the Power 9. With too many of these around, things would get truly degenerate, and often would just come down to who drew their Sol Ring first. It does have 4 points in Standard from the early days of the game, where it was just restricted, but since then, all of its points have come in Vintage, where it is very heavily played, in decks, some of which we've already mentioned. Over the years, it has seen play in artifact decks like Mud, Ravager Shops, Tezzerator, as well as in Storm decks. It is hard to imagine Sol Ring not being number 1 on this list. In 2019 alone, it has added 24 points to its score. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to binge watch the other ones, you can see the playlist on your screen now. Thanks for watching.